Montana Territory, 1888. A dawn that smelled of cold earth and horse sweat crept over the prairie. The kind of morning where the wind came sharp, rattling the loose shutters of cabins and carrying the faint whistle of meadowlarks just waking in the grass. The barn doors of James Hollister's ranch groaned as he pushed them open. A lantern swung from his hand, its weak flame casting long shadows across beams that had weathered a dozen winters. Normally, James liked these mornings quiet, steady, nothing but the soft snorts of horses and the creak of wood. For a man who had spent years living with more silence than company, it was enough. But that morning was different. As the lantern light swept across the straw, James stopped dead. There, huddled in the farthest corner of the barn, was a woman. Her dress was torn, her shawl frayed, and her face was half buried in her arms, as though she could fold herself into nothingness. Beside her, a tangle of hay shifted, and James realized, no, not alone. A small satchel, a pair of worn shoes, and when the woman stirred, the faintest wince pulled across her face. The lantern caught her skin, bruises, shadows of hurt along her cheekbone. Discoloring the curve of her arm, she jolted awake at the sound of his boots on the hay, eyes wide, the kind of fear that comes from running too long and finding no safe place to rest. Her hands pulled the shawl tighter, as though it could hide every wound. Don't. Her voice was raw, breaking. Please, don't send me away. James stood still, the weight of her plea hanging between them. He was a man built of silence, a man who had buried a wife years ago and filled the hollow of grief with work. But something in her voice, it struck, a thread he hadn't expected to feel tugged at him. He could have asked her who she was, what she was doing here, why she had trespassed into his barn, but he didn't. Instead, his hand shifted to the lantern, lowering it so the light wasn't burning in her eyes. His voice came low, steady like water poured into a cracked cup. You're safe here. The words seemed to surprise her. For a moment, she just stared, breaths sharp and quick. Then slowly, as though testing if the ground beneath her feet was solid, she nodded. James set the lantern on a beam post and walked to the old crate by the wall. From it, he pulled a folded blanket, one that smelled faintly of cedar. Without another word, he set it down near her and stepped back. She hesitated before reaching for it, clutching the fabric as though it was the first kindness she'd been offered in years. Silence stretched again. Horses shifted in their stalls. Outside, the prairie wind moaned against the barn. Finally, James spoke. Water. Her lips parted, dry, cracked. She nodded. He crossed to the bucket by the well pump, dipped the tin cup, and brought it back. She took it with trembling fingers, sipped, then pressed it close to her chest. No names yet, no stories, only two souls, one bruised, one haunted, sharing the heavy air of a barn at dawn. Don James leaned against the post, arms folded, his jaw clenched, not in anger, but in thought. Whoever she was, whatever she carried, he knew only this: he would not cast her out into the wind. And somewhere deep inside, though he didn't admit it even to himself, he wondered if this broken stranger might be the one to stir life back into a heart that had been still for far too long. The lantern burned low when James finally spoke again. His voice, roughened by years of quiet, carried a steadiness that seemed to anchor the air. Come, he said simply, motioning toward the cabin that stood a short walk beyond the barn doors. Evelyn hesitated. Her shawl slipped slightly, revealing more of the purpling marks along her arm. She pulled it close again, as if to hide not only her bruises but the shame she carried. Her eyes darted toward the door, toward the vast sweep of prairie, still drenched in dawn's chill. Leaving meant hunger, staying meant vulnerability. Her stomach, hollow and aching, made the choice for her. James didn't wait for her answer. He opened the barn doors wider, letting in the clean bite of morning air, and started toward the cabin with the stride of a man used to leading horses across wide land. Behind him, after a moment's pause, he heard the shuffle of her worn shoes on the dirt. The cabin stood plain, its timber walls weathered by years of storms. The porch slanted, but smoke curled from the chimney with the faint smell of wood fire and beans. When James pushed the door open, the warmth hit like an embrace, though the room itself was stark. A wooden table with two chairs, a stove blackened by years of use, shelves lined with tins of flour, coffee, and dried beans. Inside, a sheepdog raised its head from beside the hearth. Ears perked, it padded forward, tail swaying. Evelyn stiffened as the animal sniffed her skirt. Then, with the unguarded honesty only dogs possess, sat at her feet, eyes gentle, expectant. "Shep won't bother you," James said, pulling off his hat and setting it on a peg. "He likes company." Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. She knelt briefly, fingers brushing against the dog's head. The contact, so simple, seemed to ease something in her chest. James busied himself at the stove, pouring coffee, setting bread to warm, ladling stew from a pot he'd cooked the night before. He worked without commentary, the scrape of metal against the pot the only sound until he carried 2 bowls to the table. "Sit," he said. His tone mattered fact. Again, she hesitated. Pride told her to refuse after all. What right had she to his food, his space? But hunger pulled stronger. Slowly, she slid into the chair across from him, hands clasped in her lap, as though bracing for judgment. The first few minutes passed in silence, save for the wind rattling the shutters and the soft pant of Shep lying at Evelyn's feet. James ate steadily, his movements unhurried, his gaze never prying. When Evelyn finally lifted her spoon, the warmth of the stew seemed to thaw more than her hunger. Her shoulders loosened. Just slightly. It was the dog who broke the quiet first. Shep whined and nosed her hand, eyes bright with a beggar's plea. For the first time since James had seen her, Evelyn's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but a flicker of it as she slipped a small crust of bread toward him. James caught the moment, his own mouth twitching, though he said nothing. Instead, he poured another cup of coffee and nudged it closer to her side of the table. "You don't have to," she began softly, then stopped, swallowing. Her eyes darted to his, then away. "I ran." Her voice broke on the word. The air seemed to still, the wind beyond the shutters falling to a whisper. James set his spoon down, waiting. Her fingers knotted in the blanket draped over her lap. "My husband." She drew a shaky breath. He had hands heavier than his words. I thought if I stayed, I'd never live to see another season." The bruise on her cheek told the rest. James didn't move, didn't ask for more than she could give. He only nodded once, slow, the kind of nod that said he understood more than he let on. No pity in his eyes, no judgment either, just a quiet, steady acceptance. Evelyn lowered her gaze, waiting for the questions that never came. Instead, James picked up his spoon again and finished his meal. When he rose, he took her empty bowl without a word and rinsed it in the basin. On the table, as natural as if he had done it 1,000 times before, he left an extra plate. That night, as the prairie wind rattled the shutters and Shep dozed near the hearth, Evelyn sat wrapped in the blanket, the taste of stew lingering on her tongue. She said nothing, but in the quiet gesture of a cowboy who asked for no explanations, the first fragile thread of trust had been tied. Morning light spilled across the Montana plains, washing the grass in gold. A chorus of meadowlarks sang from fence posts, their wings scattering as Evelyn stepped out of the cabin. The blanket James had lent her still hung around her shoulders, though the chill of early summer had already begun to ease. James was already outside, hat tilted low, hammer in hand. He was mending a section of fence, his movements steady and sure, like a man who had repeated the task 1,000 times before. Evelyn lingered in the doorway, her fingers twisting the fabric of her shawl. "I can help," she said at last, her voice tentative. James looked up, eyes narrowing slightly against the sun. "Fence work isn't light," he answered. "I don't need it to be." She took a few steps closer, determination fighting through the tremor in her tone. "If I'm staying here, I want to earn my keep." For a long moment, he said nothing, only studying her, with that same unreadable steadiness. Then, with a small nod, he held out the extra pair of gloves tucked in his belt. "Suit yourself." The first attempts were clumsy. Evelyn's hands blistered quickly, and her grip on the hammer faltered more than once. Yet she refused to step back. James worked beside her, offering quiet instruction. "Hold it there. Steady now. Good." Never scolding, never mocking. By the time the fence was upright again, sweat dampened her brow, but a small, proud smile tugged at her lips. That evening, they ate cornbread and beans at the table, Shep curled between them on the floor. James said little, but Evelyn caught the faintest softening in his gaze when her blistered hands reached for her cup. She dipped her head, hiding the warmth rising in her chest. Days blurred into weeks. James taught her how to curry a horse, the brush working in long, steady strokes down the animal's flank. Evelyn's motions were jerky at first, but she listened, watched, mirrored his rhythm until the mare's coat gleamed beneath the sun. Together, They led the horses into open fields, riding side by side across seas of grass that rippled like water beneath the wind. Evelyn's skirts caught in the breeze, her laughter startled, unguarded, spilling into the air. When her mare stumbled into a trot, James slowed his horse to match her pace, the faintest twitch of amusement pulling at his mouth. In the quiet moments, the bond between them grew. Hands brushed when passing tools, shoulders touched when they leaned over a saddle. Over cornbread suppers, Evelyn would glance up and find James already watching her, his gaze quickly sliding away as though caught by accident. She felt the pull of something tender, something dangerous, weaving itself between them, yet shadows lingered. At night, James sat on the porch long after Evelyn had retired, his gaze turned toward the horizon where the prairie met the sky. In the faint orange glow of his lantern, the picture of his late wife still sat tucked in his coat pocket. Her smile, frozen in memory, was both comfort and wound. Guilt pressed heavy on his chest whenever he felt his heart stirred toward Evelyn. Loving again felt like betrayal. Evelyn carried her own burdens. Each time she caught her reflection in the cabin's small, warped mirror, she saw the faint traces of bruises not yet faded. She traced the scars on her arms with shaking fingers, whispers of her husband's rage echoing in her ears. She convinced herself James only tolerated her presence out of pity, that no man could ever look at her broken body and see beauty. The prairie reflected their turmoil. One evening, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The air turned heavy, charged with the scent of rain and dust. Evelyn stood on the porch, arms wrapped tight around herself, watching as the wind whipped the fields into restless waves. James joined her, hat pulled low, his arm brushing hers as he leaned against the railing. Neither spoke, but the silence brimmed with all they could not yet say. When the first rumble of thunder rolled across the land, Evelyn flinched. James noticed, his steady gaze flicking toward her. Without a word, he reached across the space between them. His hand didn't grasp hers, it only rested nearby on the railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin, close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. She drew in a trembling breath, letting the comfort of his nearness steady her. The storm broke overhead, rain striking the earth in heavy sheets. The prairie drank it in, wild and relentless. Inside the cabin, as the shutters rattled and Shep barked low at the thunder, James lit the lantern. Evelyn caught his profile in the glow, the strong line of his jaw, the steadiness etched into his features. For a heartbeat, her fears eased, replaced by something daring and fragile. Hope. Outside, lightning split the sky wide open. Inside, the distance between them narrowed, not in grand declarations, but in the quiet grace of two wounded souls, learning to mend alongside the land they worked. The town of Willow Creek stirred slowly under the morning sun, dust rising in lazy spirals from the dirt streets, as James led Evelyn down the main road. Her skirts were neat, but frayed at the hem, shoes dusty and worn. She kept her gaze fixed on the uneven boards beneath her feet, trying not to notice the curious eyes turning in their direction. Whispers followed them like a wind-driven tumbleweed. Some women clutched their shawls, murmuring pityingly. Men in worn hats tipped theirs ever so slightly, a look of judgment hidden in the shadows of their brims. The general store clerk paused mid-sweep, lips tightening as he glanced at Evelyn's bruised arm peeking from the sleeve of her blouse. Others whispered of scandal, of trouble brewing in the life of a lone cowboy and a woman fleeing her past. Evelyn felt herself shrank under the weight of every glance, her chest tight with shame. She tugged at her skirts, wishing she could vanish into the quiet prairie she had come from. Her heartbeat was fast, the sound of it loud against the low hum of the town awakening. James noticed, as he always did. His hand brushed hers lightly, not in a gesture meant to alarm, but to anchor. "Stay close," he murmured, the words steady, grounding. She felt a ripple of reassurance move through her, a small island of safety amidst the sea of eyes. His presence alone told her she did not have to face the scrutiny alone. At the general store, the clerk coughed, avoiding eye contact, but Evelyn could feel the weight of every gaze. The sheriff, a tall man with a weathered face, leaned against the post outside, a warning half-spoken. James straightened, the muscles in his jaw taut. The unspoken message was clear. Trouble wouldn't find her while she walked beside him. Later that day, they entered the small wooden church for Sunday service. The sun poured in through stained glass, casting long colored stripes across the floor. James guided Evelyn by the elbow, steadying her as they navigated the narrow aisles. Silent gestures replaced words. The townsfolk noticed the way he shielded her from curious onlookers, the careful space he created around them. Whispers rose anew, soft yet insistent. Evelyn's cheeks warmed. Shame and relief warred within her chest. She had feared exposure, feared that her bruises and scars marked her for judgment. Yet with James at her side, she felt seen without the sting of vulnerability. The closeness, his hand briefly resting at hers as they knelt. The protective stance he assumed near the pew spoke, louder than any words could. For the first time since fleeing her past, Evelyn realized she was no longer invisible. The world had noticed her. Yes, but she was not alone. That quiet strength, the steady presence of the cowboy who had taken her in without question, offered a new kind of courage. A courage born not from pride or defiance, but from the simple, grounding truth that someone had chosen to stand by her, even in the harsh gaze of a judgmental town. The sunlight waned across the church's wooden floor, and Evelyn allowed herself a small, grateful sigh. The whispers continued outside, but inside, her heart was calm. The prairie sun burned low over Willow Creek, painting the horizon in gold and crimson. When the thundering hooves cut through the quiet, Evelyn froze mid-step, heart clenching as a figure emerged from the dust, a familiar, menacing silhouette astride a black stallion. Caleb Carter, her husband, the very man whose cruelty had forced her to flee weeks ago. Panic surged through her chest. Her legs trembled as memories of past beatings and harsh words crashed against her mind. She tried to pull away, but James's hand on her elbow was firm, grounding. His eyes, calm and unwavering, met hers. "Stay close. I've got this." The words were silent but unmistakable. Caleb dismounted roughly, spurs clicking against the weathered wooden porch of the ranch. "Evelyn," he barked, voice thick with anger, "you're coming home with me. Now." His glare swept over James like a challenge. Assessing whether this man could be broken as easily as she had been, James stepped forward, body low, muscles coiled with controlled strength. "No," he said simply. No flourish, no threat, just certainty. Caleb's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You think you can keep her from me?" He spat, fists clenched. The standoff held the air taut, charged with danger. Dust swirled at their boots, the prairie wind carrying the echo of horses and distant crows. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps, each one punctuated by the pounding of her own heartbeat. Fear and relief warred inside her, fear of the man she had fled. Relief that James would not let harm come to her. Caleb swung a hand, aim sharp and cruel. Reflexively, James moved faster, seizing the wrist and twisting it, disarming him with a precision born of long days on the range. The pistol clattered to the ground. James's gaze locked on Caleb's, unflinching. "She stays. Under my roof. She is safe," he said, voice low but steel. Caleb's anger faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat before fury reignited. But the fire in James's eyes, the quiet authority in his posture, made the man hesitate. He measured his options and, with a final glare at Evelyn, mounted his horse. Dust kicked up as he disappeared down the trail, leaving only the echo of hooves fading into the distance. Evelyn sank to the porch steps, knees weak, palm pressed to her chest. Her body trembled not from physical exertion, but from the emotional reckoning that had just unfolded. James knelt beside her, hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The warmth of his presence, steady and unwavering, grounded her like nothing had in months. I thought he would," she began, voice trembling. James shook his head, placing a finger lightly beneath her chin. "He won't touch you again. Not while I'm here." The words were simple, but to Evelyn they carried a weight she hadn't known she longed to feel. Safety. That night, the prairie wind whispered outside the cabin, rattling the shutters against the dark. Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, bruises aching, but a seed of something new stirred in her chest. Trust, hope, perhaps, just perhaps the presence of a man like James could mean that love no longer had to be synonymous with pain. Her scars remained, a map of suffering, but James's quiet protection planted the first tender shoots of healing. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future unbound by fear, a life where hands brushing hers and gentle glances could signify love rather than danger. The ranch, once silent except for the low breathing of horses, now hummed with possibility. Outside, the stars blinked across the Montana sky, and Evelyn finally exhaled, letting the tension drain from her body. With James beside her, she felt the faint stirrings of courage, the courage to let someone care, the courage to believe that perhaps she could love again. The morning sun slanted through the cabin windows, illuminating the warm haze of the fireplace. As James moved quietly among the scattered tools and blankets, Evelyn sat on a stool, shoulders tense, hands folded in her lap, staring down at the rough wooden floor. Her body still bore the marks of past violence, faint purple and yellow bruises, marred, her skin like shadows of what she had endured. Yet the air between them was calm, safe, and infused with the unspoken promise of protection. James worked gently, his hands steady as he applied salves to her arms, cleaning each wound with care. He spoke little, letting his actions convey what words could not. "You are safe, you are seen, you are worthy." Evelyn's pulse slowed beneath his touch, the rigid walls round her heart softening with every careful movement. She had known harsh hands and angry voices, but never a touch that demanded nothing in return. That evening, the prairie wind rattled the shutters, carrying the scent of hay and distant pine. As Evelyn finally allowed herself to reveal what she had hidden, she rolled back the sleeve of her dress, exposing the bruises she had tried to cover. Her breath hitched, a blend of fear and vulnerability. James paused, looking at her with steady eyes, the corners softening in quiet reverence. Without hesitation, he leaned forward, pressing his lips gently against the first mark, a tender, deliberate kiss, not of pity, but of affirmation. One by one, he kissed the bruises, his hands lingering near her arms, steadying, comforting, wordlessly promising that she was more than her scars. Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears, the warmth in her chest blooming like sunlight through storm clouds. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting golden shadows and highlighting the raw humanity in the moment. Evelyn realized she could breathe freely again, that she could exist without fear under James's care. The intimacy was profound in its simplicity, a touch, a kiss, a quiet presence that spoke of love without conditions. For James, the act was equally transformative. He had spent years in solitude, guarding his own heart from grief and loss. And yet here he was, pouring tenderness into someone who had been broken, without hesitation or expectation. His love was patient, steadfast, and quietly heroic, expressed, not in grand declarations, but in small gestures that healed both body and spirit. By the time the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, Evelyn rested against him, her head finding its place on his shoulder. Words were unnecessary. Their breathing fell into the same rhythm, a silent acknowledgement of the trust and care now binding them. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, dust swirling in the last rays of twilight. Yet inside, a sanctuary had been forged, a place where wounds could mend, and hearts could begin to beat again. It was the first real step toward reclaiming herself, toward reclaiming hope, and toward the love she had once thought impossible. And for James, it was the first time in years that opening his heart had felt safe, right, and entirely worth it. Morning light spilled over the horizon, gilding the Montana prairie in hues of amber and rose. The wind whispered through tall grasses, carrying the scent of hay and distant pine. As Evelyn stepped onto the porch with a basket of fresh eggs, her hair caught the sunlight, soft and untamed, a vivid contrast to the bruised, weary woman who had first stumbled into James's barn months ago. Now, there was a quiet confidence in the set of her shoulders, a steady grace in her movements, and a spark in her eyes that spoke of newfound strength. James joined her with a tin mug of coffee, his hat pulled low, casting a shadow across his weathered face. Yet even in that shadow, his expression held warmth and quiet pride. They sat side by side, listening to the low murmurs of the ranch waking the soft whinnies of horses, the creak of barn doors, the distant crow of a rooster. Words were unnecessary. A glance, a shared smile, and the gentle brushing of hands as they passed tools conveyed everything their hearts had come to know. Evelyn carried out chores with a vigor that had once been unimaginable to her. She tended the garden with care, repaired fences with steady hands, and rode the fields alongside James, her laughter ringing like silver bells across the prairie. The sheepdog padded alongside them, tail wagging, a witness to the quiet joy that had become the rhythm of their days. Every action, every glance, every shared silence built a mosaic of love, not flashy, not hurried, but enduring and real. In the evenings, the cabin became a sanctuary, chairs pulled close to the hearth, the soft glow of firelight casting long shadows on the walls. Evelyn cooked, James repaired tools or sharpened knives, and sometimes they simply sat, hands brushing, exchanging unspoken reassurances. A look could communicate the deepest emotions: gratitude, trust, affection, even desire, restrained by respect and patience. These moments, small and seemingly mundane, were the foundation of a bond forged in quiet strength. When they ventured into town, the whispers that had once followed Evelyn softened into admiration. Neighbors saw a woman reborn strong, capable, and radiant, and a man whose stoic demeanor now carried warmth and subtle pride. There was no scandal here, no impropriety, only the evidence of resilience and love carefully nurtured. Even children in the streets peeked curiously at the pair, sensing the harmony and safety that enveloped them. One late afternoon, James led Evelyn to the barn to check on the horses. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The prairie wind cool and gentle against their cheeks. As they worked side by side, their hands brushed again, lingering just slightly longer than necessary. Evelyn looked up, catching James's gaze, and in that moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, their shared breath, the warmth of their hands, the unspoken understanding that their hearts had healed together. That night, back at the cabin, James poured 2 mugs of hot cider. They sat on the porch, shoulders brushing, listening to the crickets and the distant howl of a lone coyote. Their conversation was light, filled with laughter and gentle teasing, yet beneath it flowed the current of something deeper: trust, admiration, and love, resilient enough to survive past pain. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder, James wrapping an arm around her, holding her as if to anchor the fragility she had once carried. Life on the ranch had transformed them both. Evelyn's scars were still there, but they no longer defined her. They were proof of survival, of courage, of the capacity to love again. James's quiet heart, once guarded and solitary, had opened fully, finding peace not just in protecting, but in partnership. Together, they embodied a love both tender and unyielding, a bond as enduring as the prairie itself, as steady as the steady pull of the sun across the Montana sky. The prairie stretched endlessly, waves of golden grass rolling gently beneath the wind. The sun hung low on the horizon, spilling warm amber and rose across the sky, painting clouds in streaks of fire and lavender. The familiar scent of hay, horses, and earth mingled with the faint aroma of sagebrush, carrying with it the quiet peace of a land tamed not by force, but by care. James and Evelyn stood side by side in front of the barn where fate had first brought them together. What had once been a place of fear and uncertainty, its worn boards hiding a desperate secret, now radiated safety, shelter, and the promise of home. Evelyn's eyes, bright and steady, scanned the prairie. Her shoulders were unburdened, her bruises faded into memory rather than shame. She wore a soft linen dress dusted with gold from the late sun, hair gently tousled by the breeze. Beside her, James rested a hand on her waist, his posture relaxed but protective, eyes softened by the unspoken history they now shared. In the distance, the horses grazed lazily, tails flicking, their gentle movements echoing the calm rhythm that had settled over the ranch. Even the wind seemed to carry relief rather than menace, whispering through the grass like a quiet hymn of resilience. "Look at this place," Evelyn murmured, her voice low, trembling slightly with awe. "It's ours." Finally, James smiled, a rare but luminous curve of his lips, and pressed his arm around her shoulders. Their hands intertwined naturally, fingers lacing with the familiarity and trust forged through months of shared labor, laughter, and vulnerability. The sun dipped lower, casting long dramatic shadows that stretched across the barnyard, golden light reflecting on James's weathered face and Evelyn's radiant skin. In that quiet, expansive moment, words were unnecessary. Their hearts spoke in the silence, the soft exhale of wind, and the gentle brush of hands resting together. Evelyn leaned her head against James's chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat, a rhythm that had become as vital to her as her own. "I'm home," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of every fear, every flight, every tear that had brought her to this point. James tightened his embrace, resting his cheek atop her hair. "And you're not going anywhere," he said, voice steady, tender, a promise etched into the prairie air dot around them. The ranch hummed with life. The horses nickered softly, the barn's old timbers creaked in the gentle evening breeze, and the sky deepened into a tapestry of purples and dusky golds. Annie, their little companion, chased fireflies along the fence line, her laughter mingling with the sighing wind. Every sound, every motion, echoed the transformation they had all undergone from fear and grief to healing and belonging. As darkness began to settle, the first stars appeared, tiny pinpricks of light scattered across the vast Montana sky. James and Evelyn stood together, watching the horizon stretch endlessly before them, hearts aligned, lives intertwined. The land around them had been witness to pain, escape, and survival, but now it mirrored hope and quiet joy. The barn, once a symbol of desperation, was a monument to perseverance. Their love, born in adversity and nurtured in patience, had grown into something enduring, tender, and unshakable. The final image lingered, a family united, a horizon limitless, and hearts once wounded now whole. The prairie wind whispered softly across the grass, carrying the promise of tomorrow. And in that twilight, under a sky on fire, and a land that knew both struggle and redemption, Evelyn and James faced forever together.